Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. Well, we've got an important bill, Tim. It's AB 2654, and that bill addresses this use of non-disclosure agreements, or what we call NDAs, in kind of the lawmaking process here. So the bill bans lobbyists, lawmakers, and government officials from signing or requesting or even drafting NDAs during the drafting and negotiations and discussions when bills are proposed. So if these are violated, it's a misdemeanor. So Tim, this all goes back to Panera Gate, right? When the founder of Panera got a nice little carve out. They didn't have to comply with the restaurant minimum wage laws. If a company makes bread on the premises, which Panera does, they don't have to comply. So I know, Tim, you've got a lot of opinions on this.
Well, it's a very interesting bill, and certainly we were all subjected to a lot of great theater in the Assembly Elections Committee on Thursday, including the spectacle of the committee chair, Assemblywoman Gail Pellerin of Santa Cruz, who said she didn't have enough time to review the contents of the bill, and then she was literally chased down the Capitol hallway by Ashley Zavala, the dogged reporter for KCRA 3 News, and she refused to comment on the bill. It was really an exercise of how not to talk to a reporter, of course. Now, sadly, our discussion today is really an academic exercise because the bill was defeated on the expected party line vote, and it was clear majority Democrats did not want to answer a lot of the tough questions on the issues surrounding the bill. But,
a lot of what happens at the Capitol goes on behind closed doors. There's no question about that. California's open records laws are routinely criticized for being among the weakest in the nation. Every year we have Sunshine Week, which is when we rate, how are our government sunshine laws, and California routinely gets a failing grade in these areas. So that all said, and certainly the unseemliness of the Panera Gate scandal, where we don't actually know what was negotiated and they can't talk about it because they were subject to NDAs, that's very troubling. We should never have that in government, in my view. This is important public policy being set and potentially the spending of taxpayer funds being spent. We should be able to know that information. And, I think there's a kind of a reasonable way to negotiate bills without allowing the use of NDAs. There are all sorts of private negotiations that go on behind closed doors on bills. Governors allowed to deliberate in private on bills. We actually don't need NDAs. So to me, it kind of makes you wonder, what is so secret? What are you trying to hide that you need an NDA? And, it's been interesting to see both the Chamber and SEIU have come out forcefully against this bill, which kind of makes you wonder, well, when they're getting together on the same side of an issue, when there's smoke, there's fire. Kind of makes you wonder what kind of bad things are being negotiated here that we need an NDA. So I think for me, just as a principle of openness and transparency, we shouldn't be allowing NDAs, unless it's something about like a employment contract or something that is, and even at that, for a public entity, an employment contract, pretty much all the provisions of those are public. But unless there's something that, I don't know, maybe involves trade secrets or something that where there is, good reasoning, where not allowing an NDA, kind of outweighs the interests of transparency, I can't see any reason why you would need an NDA in negotiations.
So, Tim, that's a good segue to a project that we're working on now. You're working on and leading. It's called Spending Watch. So why don't you talk a little bit about that? It's a transparency project.
That's right. So there are so many bills that go on that are under consideration here in the legislature, and we have no idea how much they would cost, what their economic impact would be, what the impact on things like outmigration would be, what the impact would be on employment, the impact to taxpayers. How much would they increase your tax burden? A lot of that economic analysis either isn't done or it's done very late in the process, and the public may not have access to that analysis either. So we thought it was important to shine the spotlight on major pieces of legislation that will have a negative impact, especially on outmigration and on unemployment and on people's tax burdens. And we called the new project Spending Watch. So our economist, our Dr. Wayne Winegarden, came up with a tax and budget model through which we can plug in the details of these key bills, and then we can spit out the impact in these key areas related to the economy and the impact on people's quality of life and tax burdens and the impact on outmigration. And so the first piece that we did is the subject of our podcast today, and it's on the controversial proposal for reparations in California. And you'll hear our Dr. Wayne Winegarden in his presentation today, which was taped at our Sacramento Policy Conference from earlier this year, give a talk about how the Spending Watch project will work, and then also go through his findings on what reparations will mean for you. And it's shocking, Ro.
Yeah, I'm sure, Tim. And I really like this Spending Watch project. We're not our first analysis was on reparations, but we're doing we've since done two other bills.
That's right. One of them was on the controversial single payer legislation, which, like the young girl in the movie, it's back. AB 2200 was recently considered by the Assembly Health Committee, and we did a spending watch on that. And then there are two controversial bills that were also recently considered to expand unemployment in California, both expand who's eligible and also how much those who are eligible for payments would be able to receive in a maximum payout. They even want to expand unemployment to striking workers. Now, when we have, it's been estimated about a $20 billion deficit to the federal government in our unemployment insurance fund, and a lot of that is from the COVID era, it kind of makes you wonder, well, why are we going to be expanding unemployment even more? And Spending Watch really gives you a heads up of, these proposals that often are talked about in bland terms, often are talked about in vague terms. It really gives you an idea of what exactly is the impact going to be on consumers in California. And once again, as you'll find if you read our piece, which you can check out at pacificresearch.org, it's a big one.
Thanks for that, Tim. A couple of other things you can actually check out at pacificresearch.org. We're having two great events, all in celebration of our 45th anniversary. So on May 4th, we have a luncheon with guest author Batya Unger Sargon. She's the opinion editor of Newsweek, and she has a great new book out called Second Class, How the Elites Betrayed Working Men and Women. So our luncheon is at the Palio in San Francisco, and we hope to see you there. Another great, fabulous event, we're hosting Victor Davis Hanson in Napa Valley at the Meritage Resort on June 25th. So Victor Davis Hanson, as many of you know, is a military historian and a classics professor. So he's going to talk about the threats to the U.S., both from domestic threats and foreign threats. And we have another special guest at that evening. Fritz Maytag is the owner of York Creek Vineyards, and he's going to talk about water and wildfires and, of course, wine. It's going to be a wonderful evening. So thanks so much. And here is Wayne Winegarden.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here with you. It's a a little intimidating getting up after Steve. He was just so fantastic. And to talk economics, you guys have eaten good food, and now we're going to talk fiscal policy and economics. So I'll try to keep you awake. And we're really excited about this initiative. And it's actually, I think, exactly what Steve was saying. We're the fifth largest economy in the world. And when you look at how across the street, how we set our policy, it's absolutely terrifying. And Tim and I, we were having a conversation. I was actually walking my dogs, and we were talking, and we were just overwhelmed with just the fact that there's absolutely no analysis. Talking about accountability, there's no accountability. There's no adults in the room when we're talking about what we want to do. It's all based on, oh, wouldn't it be great? Or we should do this. But no one's actually asking kind of that adult question of, well, what does this mean? Can we afford it? And we also have in California, and this is something kind of the basis from what we're trying to do is we have this volatile budget. And right now, Governor Newsom, he's using that as an excuse. But no other state in this country has a budget that's as volatile as California. We have these periodic fiscal crises, and these fiscal crises they're absolutely predictable. They're absolutely avoidable. And it's actually a dereliction of our responsibility to not be changing what we do. I mean, if you keep touching the stove and it's hot, maybe it's time to stop touching the stove. So, when Tim and I, we were talking about this, and we said we need to do something about it. And so the whole idea was to create pieces, kind of two different parts of it, but to create pieces that begin to kind of address some of the things that we've just done that are just ridiculous. And I threw up two examples. The first one is minimum wage for healthcare workers. And there's just, it's amazing the amount of just economic ignorance that goes on when you're talking about the minimum wage. And I always go back, I think this is a Reagan retort, which is absolutely, I think, perfect, which is, what's wrong with you? If minimum wages work, why are we stopping at $25 an hour? Right? Why not 50, 100? It seems to me, if you can implement these and not have a bad impact, then, we should be going much higher. And so, but nevertheless, we implement the policy. But in California, when we implemented it, nobody went and did the work. Nobody asked you, how much is this going to cost? Well, after we passed it, somebody did it. We found out it's going to cost $8 billion. You think that may be something we'd want to know prior to passing, right? Just perhaps. It's the same thing with, and I actually, when I told my wife this, we just moved to California 3 years ago, so we're kind of one of the contrarian salmon swimming upstream. But the bill that we just passed to make our electric bills progressive. And I guess it makes sense, right? We have a progressive tax system. We should have a progressive electricity bill as well. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely unworkable. No analysis was done prior to doing this. And lo and behold, what are we doing? There's now proposals that are being put out there to repeal it because it's unworkable. And ironically, it's also inconsistent with their whole global climate change policies, right? If the whole purpose is to get people to economize on electricity use, maybe we shouldn't be subsidizing the electricity use. I mean, if we're gonna have a bad policy, at least be consistent. But I guess that's too much to ask for. So, but when Tim and I were talking about this, we're like, this is untenable. And so what we came up with is an idea. The first thing is, and I won't bore you with kind of the details, but we came up with a very straightforward kind of budget and tax model. We took the IRS data on people's income, so we know what people are making. We know how that changes. We have all the economic studies that say if you raise taxes, what happens to income, and then the follow-on effects. And so now we wanted to put ourselves in the position that when you have something going on over there, that we'd be able to respond, that we'd be able to put onto the floor. They can ignore it if they want, but at least put some numbers out there to try to get people to at least say, if you're going to do this policy, what's the cost? Have you considered this? And just have some sort of adult conversation about kind of these really important policies. And that's the goal of Spending Watch, right? Is to, some of it is going to be reactive. So we've just done our first two, one responding to the governor's budget and one talking about reparations. And as Sally said, the reparations one is terrifying, absolutely terrifying. But we also hope, just in Steve's spirit, to be optimistic, to actually maybe put some good thoughts out there, or and this is something once the legislature kind of slows down in the summer, start really benchmarking what we do. Right, we're talking about there's a new initiative to $4 billion for veterans who are homeless, and the fact that the veterans are homeless is an absolute travesty. But to think that we're not spending billions of dollars on homelessness already, and that's the problem. Again, no perspective. We need $1 billion to solve homelessness, but we're spending $10 billion, and homelessness is getting worse. Perhaps it's a different approach that we need. And we're going to talk about Dignity Moves later, and that there are fantastic private sector solutions that can really help address homelessness. But just throwing another $1 billion isn't the answer. But we need to put out actual facts. We need to put something down that says we can't legislate by intentions. We have to actually have kind of realistic outcomes in terms of what's happening. So I wanted to kind of give you kind of a quick walkthrough, and both of the Spending Watch 2 pages, short reads, are in the bags. But I just to kind of give you a sense and kind of why we're so excited about it, talk about what we've done with both of these. The first thing we wanted to look at is the governor's budget, right? And we're going to be doing this on every annual basis. We're going to be examining with the governor's budget. We're going to be looking at the May revision, just constantly watching and putting out kind of what we hope is that kind of that free market perspective of how do you kind of have a more stable budget and a more effective budget. And the idea is the state can do better with less. And that really needs to be their mantra. If they want to do worse with more, they need to be thinking about how do we do better with less. And if you're a private sector, that's what you're doing. You're spending your career doing. How do I get greater efficiencies? Questions they never ask, right? Across the street, it's judged by your success is judged by how much you spend. Oh, I spent $1 billion to address veterans. Well, what good did you do? And that's the real thing. What's driving, and that's what this chart is, and I'll explain that to you, because from an economist perspective, this is absolutely fascinating. I might be a little wonkish, and I apologize, but I love it. But the whole idea is we never ask a very simple question when we're budgeting, and the governor's budget falls for the exact same kind of trap. Right? We never ask what's the affordable level of government. What should we be budgeting toward? And the dotted line in this, if you can see it, there's a dotted line right by around 8%. And basically, that's about where we tend to go after our fiscal crises, is around spending, total expenditures, all funds, not just general fund. The general fund is becoming a smaller and smaller part of how we spend our money, more is in these special funds. But we end up spending around 8% of our personal income. And that actually, when you look at the data, that's actually kind of a pro-growth, kind of maximizing our prosperity type of spending level. But what you can also see, and that's what that red solid line is it's kind of like a roller coaster, which would be great for Disneyland, not so great if you're actually budgeting. And every time you see a crash, and we kind of go from all the governors, back from Jerry Brown, 1975, and just keep going forward up into our current governor, Gavin Newsom. And you can see that we end up with our volatile tax system, right? And when money comes in, we get really excited and we spend it all, and government becomes incredibly unaffordable. That unaffordability crashes with the economy. I mean, this is just an inevitable pattern that we see. The economy crashes, the budget crashes, we have a fiscal crisis. We solve the fiscal crisis to only get back on that roller coaster again, and we have the same pattern over and over again. And you can just see kind of over time, each one of these drops you can see is associated with a fiscal crisis. And I know Tim has lived through, I think, two of these crises you've lived through. And they're solvable. That's the just terrifying thing. If we had a more effective kind of tax system and spending, they're solvable. Well, what's really interesting about this chart is the end, right? And this isn't federal funds. And I do know COVID happened and all of this, that, and the other. These are just state funds. And if you look at we're averaging 8%, and maybe in a real bad fiscal crisis, we started spending 8.5% of our income. Well, Governor Newsom was spending 10% of our income. I mean, so we are set up for a barn burner. I know Steve was being optimistic. I have really bad news, but we are set up for a barn burner of a fiscal crisis, because even with the reductions that the governor put into his budget, and give credit where credit is due, he did cut some spending, but it's not nearly enough, right? We are at just an unsustainable amount of spending. If you talk about what can we afford, And if historically we can only afford 8%, and we're up at 9%, that is a huge, huge fiscal cliff that we are right now falling over. And for the legislature, and this is part of what we put into the in the first spending watch, to think this is a one-year event is it's just absolutely wrong. So when we're looking at how do we work with all of our rainy day funds and what do we do, you need to take into account that this is a multi-year crisis that we're probably dealing with. But also, most importantly, because you know there's going to be tax increases coming, right? That's how they're going to solve it. And I think what this makes very clear is that this is not a tax problem. This is not a revenue problem. It's a spending problem. And you can see that a little simpler, less lines here, right? If you go from 2019, when the governor took office, to 2022, kind of the height of the spending, total expenditures grew 50%. Okay, they grew 50%. Our incomes only grew about 18%. So spending grew 3 times as fast. Now, since then, spending has come down. We've cut it. So now spending is only growing 40% because we've kind of reined in. But incomes have still only grown 30%. This is the budget roller coaster that we're on. We have a very progressive tax system. Progressive tax systems are more volatile, especially when you have a California economy, Silicon Valley, biotech, all of these more cyclical industries. That this is what's going to happen when you have a progressive tax system. And so that these spending booms are just as much as part of the problem as the revenue crashes. And so that is the theme from our first kind of spending watch, or second, reparations was actually first. But that we are on a budget roller coaster of our own making, that the surges are just as much of a problem as the crashes, and that what we need to do is start thinking about, how do we cut spending? How do we create a more stable system? Now, I know that this is going to fall in deaf ears, and we're not naive enough to think that it's going to be changing minds today, but we've got to start, as Steve was saying, we've got to start planting that flag. We've got to start changing the conversation from kind of how much can we spend to instead what can we afford.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know.
Reparations, I think, is an even more terrifying subject. Has anyone actually read the report? No? One person in the back read the report? I was terrified. I didn't see the report first. I saw the executive summary, which I mistook for the report. Because the executive summary is 74 pages. It's 74 pages. The actual report's 1,000 pages. And the whole idea, and I kind of put a quote, what they're trying to do. But basically, they're trying to kind of assess what losses that California is responsible for, either because we caused those losses by horrible policies, or we could have prevented. That's a really interesting turn of phrase, right? Could have prevented, but didn't. Okay. Now, we're not going to touch any of these kind of issues just because we're just not going to touch those issues. What we did want to do, though, is say, okay, so you have this huge reparations report, and you have this huge number this dollar value that you want to say that needs to be paid. Well, what are the implications? Let's have an adult conversation about this. What are you actually talking about? Because what we keep hearing is, let's put a down payment on the reparations. And the question is, a down payment towards what? You don't put a down payment on your house without knowing what the price of the house is, no matter how expensive, what the price is. So a down payment on what? Right? Because right now they're talking about $1 billion this year. Because we have a $68 billion deficit, so we'll only spend $1 billion this year, and then 0.5% of general fund going forward. These are some of the proposals that are being put out there. So we really wanted to know, okay, what are we putting a down payment on? And so we went to Cal Matters to get some of the summary. I will fully admit I have not read all 1,000 pages. I think I skimmed through some, but not all 1,000. But if you look at kind of Cal Matters and what they said, about 2 million people are going to qualify. They said about 80% of the black population would be eligible, and the black population, I think about 2.5, 2.6 million, 80% is about 2 million people. When you look at adding up what reparations should be, and if you go through, and there's about 8 different categories that they say that there should be values that we should have to have compensation for, it came to $1.386 million. So we're going to call it $1.4 million. Now that's $1.4 million per person, which, I was like, that can't be right, because if you're a family of 4, that means you're going to be getting 5.2, if my math is right. But that is the proposal, $1.4 million. So if you just do the simple math, right, 1.4 million times 2 million, if you get your zeros right, you're talking about $2.8 trillion. So the reparations board, they got together and they basically said that California should pay 72% of its GDP in reparations. 3/4 of the state economy. Okay? So, I mean, I'm going to guess that that's not possible, right? That we can't take 3/4 of the economy and give it to others in the economy. So let's say we're going to pay it over 30 years. And I said 30 years because 30-year mortgage is the most popular mortgage. I guess you can do it over 50, 100, whatever. But let's say 30 years. And if you don't account for inflation or the time value of money, you just take 2.8 and divide it, you come up with $93 billion. Okay, that is 1/3 of Governor Newsom's 2024-2025 budget. So now, if you did that and you paid that out over 30 years, you wouldn't pay people the value of $1.4 million. You'd be paying them something significantly less. So if you want to be true to the reparations report, you have to pay them $182 billion a year, or 2/3 of the budget. So basically, we can't even figure out how to get the budget back down to 8%. But don't worry about that. We're going to spend 2/3 of it on reparations. And so it doesn't seem possible that we're going to actually cut spending to fund this. Right? I mean, it's funny because it feels weird actually walking through this logic, because it's so illogical. It's so outside of the bounds of something that's reasonable. But let's keep going through the logic, right? So if we're going to pay for reparations, and we're going to assume they're not going to cut the budget by 2/3, and they're not going to cut it by 1/3, then that only leaves one possibility, right? We're going to have to raise taxes. But we're raising taxes to fund, and let's just kind of let's be reasonable, and let's just do the lower end estimate. So we're just going to add up to 1.4 billion over 30 years. We're not going to really give people 1.4 billion, 1.4 million spending power. The numbers are so big, I'm getting my B's and M's mixed up. You would still need, just to get that lower number, the most extreme tax increase in history. Now, how would they do it? They're going to say tax the rich. But the bottom line is, and I actually ran the numbers, and you can't get $94 billion by taxing the rich. It's just, and I should preface all of this. Economic models, the only way they work is basically, what's the relationship from the past, right? So you look at kind of how things responded in the past, and you say, if past is prologue, this is going to be the outcome. I mean, we love to put lots of equations and do lots of fancy things, but in essence, that's all you're doing. You're saying, okay, if past is prologue, what's going to happen? Well, when you've never had something this extreme, all of our historical experience is probably not worth that much. It's probably going to be a much more extreme economic catastrophe. But that's all we have to go on. So we're going to just kind of look at that past. And they haven't, of course, and this is the problem. We talk about how we need to implement reparations, but there's no reasonable proposal to tell us what that means, right? So we're going to just assume that we're going to do an across-the-board tax increase across our 3 major taxes, right? Our personal income tax, our sales tax, and our corporate income tax. Mind you, our corporate income tax hasn't been raised in decades. It's 8.84%. But in order to get close to that 93 billion, and in the model it came out to 95 billion, you have to do a 3.25 percentage point increase, okay, across the board. So the 1% rate would go to 4.25. The 2% rate would go to 5.25, all the way down to the personal income tax. So if you're unlucky enough to be a millionaire in California, you'd be paying 16.55% of your taxes just in the state income tax. Then, of course, you have the 35% federal tax, and you have the 2% or 2.9% kicker, because that's going to keep going on. So you're going to be paying well over 50% of your income in taxes at the highest rates. We're also going to tax corporations at over 11%, and we're going to increase the sales tax to over, including the statewide local tax, to well over 10%, 10.5%, almost 11%. So 11% sales tax. The average family is paying a 9% income tax. Corporations are paying 11% tax. So this is going to be the economic kind of incentives of the state. And that's, mind you, a 50% increase in the tax rates for the average family on income tax. It's a 50% tax increase on your sales tax burden. So, percentage points kind of get confusing, but in actual dollars, you're increasing these by half for the average family. That's going to have implications. That's going to be bad for the economy. That's going to be bad for jobs. And when we ran it through the model, and with the caveat, right, that we have no experience of something this dramatic, this huge of an increase, what we see is, okay, if the economy is kind of growing like this, and we implement the policy so it's going to grow slower, just in 5 years, the economy is going to be 11% smaller, based on our model. When you're talking about incomes, they basically stagnate. They're going to be about 6% smaller, right? We're going to have almost 5% fewer jobs in the state. And to me, what's most terrifying, and what is clearly understated, is that 1.8 million people will have left the state during that time. Ideally, I'd like to fudge it and say, about 25 million, 30 million people leave the state. I don't know. It's hard to believe that would be the only impact. But again, we're talking about something so extreme. And so this is kind of, I think, really sums up what we're really hoping Spending Watch can do, is that if you want to talk about reparations, fine. That's great. You're duly elected. But you can't talk about it, or you shouldn't talk about it. I guess you can do whatever you want, but you shouldn't be talking about it in a vacuum. You shouldn't be talking about it without knowing what the costs are, both in terms of the budget and in terms of the economy and in terms of how you're going to impact families. Because under this proposal, you're destroying, as opposed to what Steve wants to do, if you do this, you're going to destroy the California dream. You're going to make it completely unaffordable for families. You're going to encourage families to leave, and you're going to just make it impossible. Housing doesn't matter what goal you're trying to achieve. You just wouldn't be able to. And so that's, like I said, the goal of Spending Watch. The first two, both those topics are in the bag, and we're really excited and hoping that we'll be able to at least make politicians consider the actual costs of some of these proposals they're putting out there.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.